In the last lesson, we considered the beginning of Book 1 of Plato's Republic, and we also talked about his conversations with Cephalus and with Polemachus. The beginning illustrated the conflict between wisdom and power within the social order, raising the question whether it is possible to construct a political order where those who have power are themselves wise, or at least are willing to listen to the wise. That's the implicit question at the very beginning of the Republic. In the conversation with Cephalus, we delved into some of the complexities of common opinions about justice. While justice does seem to consist, for the most part, in following certain rules or commandments, it's also clear that those rules or commandments sometimes have exceptions. And so we can't claim to know what justice is until we can explain both the rules and the exceptions. Until we can understand that, we can't really claim to be just. In the conversation with Polemachus, we saw Polemachus attempt to defend his father's definition by arguing that justice consists in giving to each what is owed, and that really means helping friends and harming enemies, or as I suggested, serving the common good of your community or your group. But Polemachus is unable to defend this definition because he rejects certain implications of it, such as that stealing is okay as long as you're benefiting your group, or that it's okay to help bad people as long as they're a part of your group. Right? And he even got backed in the corner of claiming that, well, in fact, actually it's never just to hurt anyone, which of course makes it very hard for you to be useful in any way, even to the good people in your group. So we have basically some confusion. We have brought out some aspects of the understanding of justice. It's a virtue. It's beneficial. For the most part, it consists in following rules, but not just that. But we don't have a clear definition of what justice is yet. But Polemachus's assumption, which Socrates does not challenge, that justice is good and virtue, gains the ire of Thoracimicus, who finally takes the opportunity to intervene in the conversation quite angrily, insulting Socrates and claiming to have a superior understanding of justice, and one that shows that justice is not, in fact, good for you. Thoracimicus offers his own definition. Justice is the advantage of the stronger, and that it is better to be unjust than just whenever you can get away with it, and best of all is to be a tyrant, who is injustice incarnate. But he proves unable to defend these claims against Socrates' cross-examination, and he ends up angrily sulking and trying to get out of the conversation. So Socrates refutes him, but surprisingly, at the end of Book 1, Socrates admits that his refutation of Thoracimicus is inconclusive, that in fact, as he says, they've learned nothing, because he refutes Thoracimicus without ever actually arriving at a definition of justice. And Socrates says, well, how can you ever prove that it's good to be just if you don't even know what justice is? So, back to the drawing board. That's the way he ends Book 1. So in today's lesson, we will investigate the conversation between Socrates and Thoracimicus. First, we'll look at Thoracimicus' first attempt to define justice as the advantage of the stronger, and Socrates' refutation. Then, we'll look at Thoracimicus' restatement of his definition of justice, which also includes the claim that best of all is to be a tyrant, and to be completely or perfectly unjust. That's the best life. And then we will briefly look at Socrates' refutations of that claim. As I mentioned, Socrates finishes by saying that his refutation is inconclusive, and so that's why, for purposes of time, I'm not going to go into great detail with those refutations. And then I'll end you with what I think are some of the major issues left on the table at the end of Book 1. So to begin with, Thoracimicus' claim that justice is the advantage of the stronger. Now, Thoracimicus bursts into the conversation between Socrates and Polemachus and accuses Socrates of both foolishness and vanity. And on top of that, he also accuses him of dishonesty. He claims that Socrates is looking foolishly in the wrong place to find justice. And presumably he claims this because Socrates seems to adopt the assumption that justice is something good, and Thrasymachus thinks that it's misleading to assume that about justice. But he also claims that this kind of strange conversation between Socrates and Polemarchus is something that Socrates is deliberately engineering. He accuses Socrates of dishonesty. And the claim he makes here is something that others have made about Socrates. He says, Socrates, you go around asking people questions, and when they give you an answer, then you make yourself look smart by refuting them. But then you turn around and claim that you don't know anything, and so you refuse to ever subject your own opinions to the same treatment. So you get to go around looking really smart and never taking any risks. Vainglory. So he accuses Socrates of dishonest argumentation in service of his own pride. He accuses Socrates of irony, of hiding his true thoughts. So at first Thrasymachus insists that he wants Socrates finally to give his own opinion, but finally he relents on that and becomes willing to offer what he believes is the superior definition that he himself has arrived at. And remember, doing so, this is part of Thrasymachus's job. He is a sophist. He goes around teaching what he thinks will be useful knowledge to ambitious people. So he actually has something to gain by sharing his own definition of justice, because if he can convince the other people present for the conversation that he's smarter than Socrates, he might win himself some customers. So it's not surprising that at the end of the day, Socrates is able to get Thrasymachus to offer his own definition. And that definition is that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Somewhat vague at first, Socrates seeks some clarification. And so to begin with, Socrates makes it very clear that when Thrasymachus talks about the stronger, he doesn't mean the physically stronger. Rather, Thrasymachus means the advantage of the stronger in the political sense, and he explains himself as follows. In every city, Socrates, there's some ruling group. Maybe it's the democracy, maybe it's oligarchs or aristocrats or a tyrant, but in every city there is some group that it's in charge, and that is the stronger. They're the ones who dominate the society. And what do? They make laws, and they make rules, and they impose those laws on the whole community, and they say that those laws are just, and that everybody must follow them, and if they break those laws, they will be punished. But those laws that they make are not for the good of the community as a whole. In point of fact, the ruling group makes laws to benefit themselves. So that, in effect, the ruling group in any city is using the law, using justice, as a covert way of exploiting the community. So the powerful group in every city makes laws to benefit themselves, and they call those laws justice. Therefore, Socrates, everywhere you look, the just is really the same thing, the advantage of the stronger, imposed on the community through law. And, what that implies in a way is really that what passes for justice in any given community is really a kind of concealed injustice. And it's a rather cynical opinion, you might say, since it rests on the premise, I think, that people are ultimately self-interested, and when they have power, they use it primarily to benefit themselves. And this, of course, implies, and I think this is what Thrasymachus is getting at, that there really is no such thing as a common good. Human life, political life, is made up of conflicting interests held by self-interested individuals and groups struggling for power. Now, this may be cynical. It might also be true. It might be a true description of politics. I would suggest that it is an accurate description of politics, at least in a lot of circumstances, and you can consult the news to see that. Now, Socrates, interestingly enough, manages to refute this definition, but without really ever calling into question whether Thrasymachus's depressing opinion might not be an accurate description. He gets Thrasymachus really more on a technicality, as we might say, and here's how it works. He points out that Thrasymachus' definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger can't be universally true. It can't be true 100% of the time, because rulers are fallible. And that means sometimes the laws they make will turn out not to be to their own advantage. Yeah, he doesn't give any examples, but you can think of some. Say, for example, some rapacious ruling class keeps increasing taxes more and more until finally it causes the rest of the society to revolt against them and overthrow them. In that case, big mistake. You thought you were enriching yourself, but what you really did was fomented a rebellion that got you overthrown. Oops. Right? And Thrasymachus admits, yeah, of course, rulers make mistakes in these areas. They are fallible. And then Socrates says, well, but you always have to do what the rulers say, right? It's just to obey the rulers, and it's unjust to disobey them. And Thrasymachus says, yes. And so what follows then is that justice isn't always the advantage of the stronger. Because when the rulers make laws or issue commands that are not in their own interest, people still have to obey them, even though in that case, by obeying them, for example, paying these higher and higher taxes until finally they get sick of it, when they obey them, they're not actually serving the interests of the rulers. And so you see, what happens here is you get a result that's similar to what you had in the refutation of Cephalus. In the case of Cephalus, we arrive at this conclusion that, for the most part, it's just to tell the truth, but sometimes it's not. So in the same way here, we arrive at what Thrasymachus is really backed into, I think, having to support, is that, for the most part, following the law and being just is advantageous to the rulers, but sometimes it's not, because sometimes they make mistakes. So it's not the case that justice is always the advantage of the stronger. So and there's a way to save this definition. This is not a crippling objection. And in fact, a different character named Cleitophon interjects at this point in the conversation and says, wait, well, but Socrates, all that Thrasymachus was really saying is that the rulers make laws that they think are to their own advantage. Sure, sometimes they make mistakes, but it's still the case that they always have the same intention. They're always trying to benefit themselves, even if they make mistakes. And Socrates says, well, that's not precisely what Thrasymachus says, but let's see if this is right. Is this true, Thrasymachus? Are you saying that justice consists in what seems to be the advantage of the stronger, whether it is or isn't, in truth? And the funny thing is that if Thrasymachus accepted this slight change, he could have saved his definition, because basically he could say rulers are always self-interested, but they're not always wise. But instead, he rejects this change. He rejects it, and he says, no ruler who makes mistakes truly deserves to be called stronger when he's making mistakes. Now, this word stronger in Greek, it has the notion of kind of superior power, but it also has a kind of connotation of superior excellence, right? So what he's saying is, people who make mistakes, they're not the best kind of people. When they're being stupid, they're not really stronger, right? And now he illustrates this point. He says, look, a doctor is a person who knows how to heal patients, right? The goal of medicine is to heal. And properly and precisely speaking, you earn the title doctor when you acquire the art of healing. Now, when a doctor mistakenly kills a patient he's trying to heal, that is, when he fails to act according to the art of healing, he isn't really acting like a doctor in that moment, because doctors heal, they don't harm. So if we were always to speak precisely, we would never say, the doctor has mistakenly killed his patient. Instead, what we would say is, the man who is usually a doctor has failed to be a doctor in this case, because he has mistakenly killed his patient, whereas a true doctor heals. So the doctor in the precise sense is the one who correctly practices the art of medicine. And when it is incorrectly practiced, he's not really acting like a doctor. So in the same way, a ruler in the precise sense. The person who truly deserves the name ruler, and thus truly deserves the name stronger, is the person who knows how to use power to benefit himself and doesn't make mistakes. That's truly the stronger, and justice consists in obeying that person. So justice, he maintains, is still what I said it was, the advantage of the stronger. So he claims to be sticking to this same definition, but in fact he's changed his definition, even though he claims not to have. Before, when he said justice is the advantage of the stronger, by stronger he simply meant the ruling class, which he admitted is often fallible. They're stronger because they're in charge. Now, by stronger, Thoracimicus means only those rulers who don't make mistakes. And these are the people he calls rulers in the precise sense. So the definition of justice is still verbally the same, the advantage of the stronger. But substantively it's different because he's changed the definition of stronger. It's no longer the factual ruling class. Instead, it's those who truly possess the art of ruling and don't make mistakes. So why would he make this change but pretend that he hasn't? And I think the answer is fairly simple. He wants to avoid at all costs being refuted by Socrates. So what he does is he finds a way of keeping the same words by changing their substance and can claim that Socrates' attempted refutation is a failure. I think that's why he does it. It becomes clear in the dialogue he's proud. He has potential customers around him. He doesn't want to admit that he's made a mistake. But in fact, he has changed his definition. Socrates has forced him to change his definition. And once he changes his definition, it changes the conversation. Before, the conversation had been a kind of empirical question, right? Do rulers always use their power to try to benefit themselves? It was an empirical question. Now, you could say it's become more of a normative question, because Thoracimicus has implicitly said, anybody who's smart will serve his own interests as much as possible. And that means rulers, if they're smart, will seek to benefit themselves at the expense of the rest of the community. And now the question becomes, well, is that really true? Do smart rulers really seek to exploit those that they rule? That's the question now. And Socrates is able to refute him fairly easily, although through a questionable argument. The premise of Socrates' refutation is Thoracimicus' claim that ruling is an art, a kind of technical expertise. To be a ruler in the precise sense means to be an expert in exploiting others through politics. It's the art of commanding others for your advantage. That's what Thoracimicus seems to mean, knowing your own good and how to get it. But Socrates notes that there are many arts that involve commanding or ruling over other people. Doctors give orders to patients, right? That's the example even that Thoracimicus had used. Captains give orders to sailors. But in the case of every other art, the person who's in charge, the person giving orders, is not aiming at his own good, but rather at the good of others. The doctor's art is aimed not at the good of the doctor, but at the good of the patient. The art of the captain is aimed at getting the ship and the sailors home to port. It's not aimed at the good of the captain. In the case of every other art that rules over others, it seems to be aimed at the advantage of others, not at the advantage of the ruler. Now, as Socrates will note shortly, it is the case oftentimes that these people will receive payment in exchange for their services. But that just shows that the services themselves are aimed at the good of someone else. And so, in return, the person who's in charge will receive some benefit to make it worth his time. Right? So the captain brings the ship safely to port, and in return is paid. The doctor saves the patient, and in return is paid. So Socrates concludes, therefore, that no knowledge or art rules over others for the sake of the person who's in charge, but rather all of these arts are aimed at the good of others, of other things, of what the art is set over. Every art, he seems to say, is selflessly devoted to the good of something other than itself. doctors to the good of patients, captains to the good of sailors. And since in each case the person who's in charge, the ruler, is the stronger party, and those who are ruled are the weaker, right, like patients or the pilots, it follows that no ruler rules for the advantage of himself, the stronger, but rather rulers in the precise sense rule for the advantage of the weaker. Right? And so you arrive at the opposite of what Thrasymachus had said. Thrasymachus said rulers in the precise sense ruled for their own advantage, the advantage of the stronger. Socrates says no, rulers in the precise sense rule for the advantage of the weaker, for somebody else. And so things have gotten turned upside down. But of course there are a few problems with this definition, and they're ones that Thrasymachus sees immediately and attacks. The first one, of course, is that even if a particular art might aim at the good of something else, so for medicine aims at the good of patients, it could still be that the person who practices the art, the doctor, is self-interested, right? So that the artisan, the ruler, is self-interested in the way that Thrasymachus says. That still seems to be a possibility, even if the direct object of medicine is the good of patients. Right? And you can think of this, where you see this, how sometimes an unscrupulous doctor will have a very shoddy medical practice because really his personal goal is not healing people but getting rich. And so he cuts corners. Socrates' claim that rulers always seek the advantage of the weaker seems very naive indeed when you see how human beings actually act. But there's a second problem, an even more immediate problem, with Socrates' claim that rulers rule for the advantage of the weaker. And that's that there seem to be a number of arts that don't fit Socrates' description. Arts that are obviously not invented or practiced for the sake of what they're set over. One example, and the one that Thrasymachus seizes upon, is shepherding. Shepherding, the art of shepherding, was it invented for the good of sheep or for the good of shepherds? Now, the answer here, Thrasymachus thinks, is quite obvious, and this gets us to his second big speech, where he makes the case for tyranny. So Thrasymachus says that Socrates has to be a real rube if he thinks that shepherds practice their trade for the good of their sheep. Everyone knows that shepherds care for the sheep in order to use the sheep. The goal of shepherding isn't to have fields full of happy sheep, it's to have lamb chops, and wool. Right? That's the goal of shepherding, not the good of sheep. And he says the same thing holds for political ruler. The rulers are the shepherds, and the people are the sheep. They're to be fleeced and exploited. And you have to be naive to think otherwise. And this is why Thrasymachus says that rulers rule for their own advantage. They treat the people as sheep to be exploited. And this is why, as he says, justice is someone else's good, while injustice is one's own advantage. And what he means here is, if you think of injustice as being willing to harm others and take what belongs to them for your own benefit, Thrasymachus is saying, that's beneficial. It's beneficial to be somebody who has the power to take things from others and enjoy them for oneself. Whereas being just respecting other people's things, keeping your hands off of them, that's good for other people, but it's not good for you. For you, it's just self-restraint. So being just, following the rules, it's for suckers. Smart people break the rules whenever they can to get more for themselves. Just to say a little bit more about what Thrasymachus is getting at here, you think about it this way. The just man, in sort of common sense, we saw this with Cephalus, is the person who follows the law, who tries to be honest, who respects other people's rights, tries to do the right thing. This man, Thrasymachus implies, is a sheep. What does he get? What good is it to him, all this justice that he practices towards others? It's no good at all. He just leaves himself to being exploited by people who are willing to break the rules. Unjust people, when they're clever, are always better off, right? When a just man makes a deal, he'll stick by it. When an unjust man makes a deal, he'll break the deal if it's more advantageous to do so, and so he'll be better off. When a just man pays his taxes, he pays exactly what he owes. Whereas the unjust man, when he can get away with it, will cheat, and thus be able to keep more for himself. The just man, when he holds political office, will follow the rules and be impartial and refuse to take money from the public till or hand down corrupt decisions that might benefit himself. Whereas the unjust man, when he has political office, whenever he can, will accept bribes, will break the rules if it's advantageous to him or to others who depend on him. And so he'll be better off. He'll use the power to his own advantage. So in all these cases, the unjust man seeks his own advantage by taking from others what belongs to them whenever he can. Whereas the just man just makes do with what he's entitled to, even when he could have more. But again, Thoracimicus is implying, what advantage is it to you to treat others fairly? It just means you have less. Whereas the person who's willing to, in effect, throw fairness out the window will be able to have more of the stuff that makes life worth living. And, to come back to his original definition, Thoracimicus implies that that kind of unjust behavior is precisely what rulers do, oftentimes under the cover of law. In the guise of laws made for the common good, they in fact exploit people for the advantage of the rulers. And Thoracimicus says this is clearest if you consider injustice at its most complete or most perfect, which is tyranny. The tyrant is the man who seizes everything, even the freedom of the people who live under him. He takes everything he possibly can for himself, and as a result enjoys a greater share of the good things in life than do others. Again, so long as he's clever and knows what he's doing and doesn't make mistakes. So the intelligent tyrant is the happiest of men because he has the greatest share of the good things. And how does he get that? By taking them from others. Whereas the person who always seeks to do what's right is a pitiable simpleton. Now this is a powerful argument, I think, that demands a response, because a lot of people, both then and now, seem to agree, even if they don't quite admit it, with what Thoracimicus is saying. Because if happiness does lie in things such as power, pleasure, money, and the like, it would seem that Thoracimicus is right. If happiness depends on how much stuff you have and how powerful you are, then the clever Machiavellian will always end up better off than the simple good man who keeps his nose clean and follows the rules. Right? Because the clever Machiavellian doesn't let his conscience stop him from seizing more for himself. And if that's where happiness is, then he's happier. Now, what this means is that if it is, in fact, better to be just, if you are, in fact, happier if you are a good and just person, you have to find some way to show why it is personally beneficial to treat others fairly, why it is good for you to be impartial. And that's not an easy thing to show, right? And it's also not easy to show how a clever tyrant who has everything he wants and has the power to do whatever he wants to do, it's not easy to show that despite all that, such a man is wretched. Oftentimes he certainly doesn't look wretched. So countering Thoracimicus's claims is difficult. You have to uncover the personal benefit of treating others well, and you have to uncover the secret wretchedness of having the power to do whatever you want. That's somewhat paradoxical. And Socrates doesn't make the case here. That's why the book starts again, why the Republic starts over in Book 2. Instead, he supplies what I've said is an inconclusive refutation of Thoracimicus. And I'm not going to go into great detail here, again, because we lack time, and because Socrates admits that these arguments aren't fully adequate. But, as an overview, Socrates does four things. First, he once again disputes the claim that justice is the advantage of the stronger. He disputes the claim that any ruler in the precise sense, or artisan, aims at his own good. But he offers a slightly different proof of this here, because he says, look, if ruling were good for the ruler, then he wouldn't ask for any wages in addition. Right? If ruling were its own benefit, were intrinsically beneficial, there would be no need also to ask for wages, because simply by being in charge, you would be benefiting yourself. So if somebody asks for wages, then that proves that the job they're doing or the work they're doing is not beneficial to them. That's why they need the wages, to make it worth their time. So therefore, no art can rule for its own advantage, because every artisan asks for wages. And the same must hold for political rulers. Now, this is not an adequate argument, and if Thrasymachus had more of his wits about him at this point, he's flustered by Socrates, but if he had more of his wits about him, he would see that this really is not an adequate argument, because Thrasymachus himself says, yes, exactly, why do people want to be in charge? So that they can get lots of stuff. They don't like being in charge for its own sake. They want to be in charge because they want the power to seize the things they want, their wages. So we see then that Socrates hasn't exactly disputed the claim that rulers might be self-interested. What he has disputed is Thrasymachus's claim that justice is the advantage of the stronger. And he has rejected that, even though by adding the fact that rulers ask for wages, he has actually given some ground to the claim that rulers do have some self-interest. But now, what happens at this point is that Socrates actually shifts a little bit. He says, I don't accept Thrasymachus's definition of justice as the advantage of the stronger, but Thrasymachus has made another important claim, namely, that the unjust life is better than the just life. So let us investigate that question, and then if we're able to, we can come back to the question of the definition of justice. So he actually shifts over to a different question. And at this point, he offers three different arguments against the claim that the unjust life is better, more personally beneficial, than the just life. First argument, he argues that wisdom and virtue are aligned with justice and not with injustice. The truly wise and excellent person will choose to be just. The argument that he gives in defense of this claim is quite complex and convoluted, and Thrasymachus is really not able to follow it and gets so flustered that at the end of it, he blushes. He knows he's been bested, but he's not quite sure how. And he says to Socrates, in effect, I don't know how you refuted me, but I do have some things to say, but if you won't let me make a speech, if you insist on keeping and going with this question and answer way of arguing, then I'll just smile and nod and go along with whatever you say, and I'm not really going to answer sincerely anymore. So in other words, he says he's going to sulk. And Socrates, strangely enough, says, fine, go ahead and do that. We're going to keep going. And I think the reason why is because at this point the argument is really continuing more for the sake of Glaucon than for the sake of Thrasymachus. Glaucon is very interested in seeing how Socrates will defend justice. So Socrates argues that wisdom and virtue consist in justice, not in injustice. The second argument he makes is that justice is, in fact, mightier than injustice, contrary to what Thrasymachus had said. And then finally, in the third argument, he claims that since justice is wisdom and virtue, and since you need wisdom and virtue in order to live well and be happy, it follows that you need to be just in order to live well and be happy. And in this way, he seems to have proven the superiority of the just life over the unjust life. But then, strangely enough, after having made these refutations of Thrasymachus, he turns around and says that the arguments he's just made are, in effect, worthless. How on earth, he says, can we possibly prove that justice is better than injustice if we still don't actually know what justice is? We can't know whether justice is good or bad until we first know what it is. And we haven't done that. We skipped that. So in fact, even though he's refuted Thrasymachus, he says at the end that it's inconclusive. We've got to go back to the drawing board. And that's where he leaves things at the end of Book 1. As we see, Glaucon will insist that Socrates start over. He's not willing to let the conversation stop there. And so in the next lesson, we'll see how Glaucon, and in addition to Glaucon, Adeimantus, beg Socrates to give an account of what justice is, and then to prove that it's always better to be just than unjust. And everything else in the Republic is really follows from Socrates' attempt to meet their request. But I want to leave you with the following conclusion that I think can be drawn from the refutation of Thoracimicus, even if the arguments are inconclusive. It seems to me, and to a number of other scholars, that Socrates has kind of left two different opinions about justice on the table. And they're two opinions that are potentially reconcilable, but potentially not. So there are two opinions that are in tension with one another. On the one hand, there is this opinion that justice is a virtue, that it is a part of human excellence, and anybody who wants to live well and be happy and live the best possible human life must be just. Right? And this is an opinion about the way justice as a virtue is good for you to have, because it enables you to live a good life. How it does that? Not quite so clear. But that people have this opinion that you need to be just in order to live well, that's clear. People like Glaucon and Polemarchus believe that. But then, on the other hand, there's another opinion about justice, right, which we've talked about before, is that justice essentially consists in following certain rules and certain norms of behavior because they're good for others or good for the community, right? And this is justice as a social virtue. This is also the understanding of justice that we find in, for example, Polemarchus's attempt to define justice as helping friends and harming enemies. Justice as a social virtue whereby you serve the good of your community and the good of others. So that's justice as good for somebody else. So then the question becomes, how do you bring these two opinions about justice together? Can you? Can you prove that justice is both inherently good for you and for others? Can you prove that it is good for you to treat others fairly? And this points to a broad question which is explored over the course of the Republic, which is, what precisely is the relationship between your own private good, your personal good on the one hand, and the good of the community on the other? Because justice, if it is truly a virtue, would seem to hold out the promise that in being good for others, you are also being good for yourself. But the question is, can those two aspects of justice be brought together into one coherent understanding? Or is it, for example, that Thoracimicus is right and that justice is good for others but is not good for you? And this is the question that will emerge again in Book 2 and will emerge at other points over the course of the Republic. There is certainly the hope with Glaucon and Adeimantus that Socrates can bring the self-regarding aspect of justice and the other regarding aspect of justice together. And the rest of the Republic is an attempt to address this hope.